the Federalist Society. The Federalist Society has three bedrock principles: that the state exists to preserve freedom, that the separation of powers is essential to our Constitution, and that it is emphatically the province and duty of the judiciary to say what the law is and not what it should be. To that end, we have a host of events and programming around the law school, and I would just particularly like to say a word to students from other schools within the university and undergraduates that are here tonight, maybe for the first time at the law school, that we have some really fascinating and engaging and diverse lunchtime talks and, as our sort of keystone programming. If you're interested in attending those, which I did as an undergrad to great edification, please just get in touch with one of the board members that's here tonight. Maybe the board members could just raise their hands that are here. Just talk to us and we'll get you on our email list and make sure that you receive information about upcoming lunch events. They happen at least once a week throughout the semester. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Rusty Reno, is the editor of First Things, a leading American journal, perhaps the leading American journal of religion and public life. He serves on the board of advisors of the Edmund Burke Foundation, the sponsor of the 2019 National Conservatism Conference. After earning a doctorate in religious studies from Yale, he taught theology at Creighton University for 20 years. He lives in New York City now as a father of two and husband of one. And his new book, which is central to tonight's remarks, is entitled The Return of the Strong Gods, Nationalism, Populism, and the Future of the West. He argues there that post-World War II, the project of the open society has hardened into a set of dogmas which destroy the social solidarity rooted in faith, family, and nation. Today, as a result, while our elites worry about the return of fascism, our societies are dissolving. But man will not tolerate social dissolution forever. As Dr. Reno argues, man longs for shared loves, which give life meaning, the so-called strong gods, or the powerful loyalties which bind men to their homelands and to one another. They will return, Dr. Reno warns, in one form or another. And rather than persisting in banishing love from politics after the ideal of the open society, he argues that we should support the populist call for the return of something worth loving and serving to our political life. We should tutor that impulse, he says, as best we can, and conduct it towards those strong gods which appeal to reason and to our hearts to bring out the best in society. Otherwise, we shall invite the darker gods whose return our open society was intended to forestall. Without further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome to law school Dr. Rusty Reno.
It's a pleasure to be here. And I'd like to thank the Abigail Adams Institute and the Federalist Society here at Harvard for inviting me to speak today. And it's always flattering to speak about a book that one has recently written and published, although it's difficult sometimes to speak about it because presumably I put it as well as I could in the book. And so my remarks today will probably be less adequate than the book itself. But I want to give you a sense of what I'm arguing in this book and also tilt it in the direction of thinking about our role, your role, our role in the future of American society. So to begin, I mean, this notion of strong gods, it can, and their return, it can seem confusing to people and even frightening. Now, I would submit that the confusion is necessary. Public life is not a system or a machine. It is an organism alive with passions, quivering with nightmares, and thrilling to dreams. The sociobiologists, the game theorists, econometricians, sociologists, political scientists, legal scholars, these and other specialists can shed light on social reality, but they can never capture the whole. We must find our way as best we can with images, intuitions, and metaphors that illuminate rather than explain, and that's the sense in which I want to use this metaphor of strong gods. And yes, this image of strong gods can be threatening, or can feel threatening, it can seem threatening. But I am increasingly convinced that this is a good thing too, for we must be hit, and hit hard, in order to be awakened from our complacent slumbers. Our ruling class, of which we are part, is decadent, and the institutions such as Harvard contribute to today's destabilizing misrule. We are creating an inhospitable society and a culture of homelessness. So let me illustrate this misrule with a paradox. The farther we get from 1945, the more intense anti-fascism becomes. Antifa street gangs would have been unimaginable in the generation that fought in World War II, the people who actually did fight fascism. And moreover, the use of the term, the derogation of calling someone a fascist in that generation was not common. Now, however, the term fascist is used as a term of assassination, and it's used widely. And the same holds for anti-discrimination more broadly. The farther we get from the landmark case of Brown v. Board of Education and the legislative victories of the mid-1960s, the more minute and pervasive accusations of discrimination become. So these two paradoxes, it seems to me, the way in which the farther we get from Adolf Hitler, the more alive he is in our imagination, and the farther we get from these landmark achievements of the civil rights movement, the more preoccupied we are with race and discrimination, that these paradoxes lead, it seems to me, to a deeper and more troubling paradox. Today, at the institutions most likely to advertise their commitments to diversity and openness, more and more topics are taboo. Pronouns are carefully monitored. Most self-censor, not just in what they say out loud, but even in what they allow themselves to think. As Ryszard Legutko, a Polish philosopher and EU parliamentarian, observes in a forthcoming article in First Things magazine, this self-censure is a sure sign of totalitarianism. So it's a kind of paradox. The intensified commitment to diversity coordinate with the ever minute self-monitoring of what we say and even what we allow ourselves to think. Now, in the book, Return of the Strong Gods, I try to explain these paradoxes by telling a story of the post-war, what I call the post-war consensus. When I look in the room, I realize that not everybody is as old as I am, and I always have to remind young people that post-war means post-World War II. So, although someone of my generation, the word post-war always means post-World War II.
Because we never finished wars, we're never post-war.
Yeah, well put. So I explain these paradoxes by telling this story. And this consensus saw our problems, manifold problems, as rooted in an over-consolidated or closed society, against which the consensus prescribed strong doses of openness. So this kind of closed versus openness dynamic runs through the book. In the United States, conservatives took up the cause of an open economy, I would call it, while liberals have emphasized the open culture. For the World War II generation, this openness was counterbalanced by consolidating solidarity, emphasizing and solidarity creating elements. In the 1950s, for example, Robert Taft, or Mr. Republican as he was known, was an ardent opponent of the New Deal. But he observed that a free economy requires citizens shaped by a strong moral culture. So you have the openness of the economy balanced by something consolidated, a strong moral culture. And during the same era, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., such an important figure for post-war liberalism, argued that the individualism of a liberal society, which he endorsed, must be matched by economic solidarity of the sort that the Democratic Party supported after the New Deal. Now, by the 1990s, as I spell out this story in my book, by the 1990s, the balancing gave way to increasingly one-sided emphases on openness. The center-right became libertarian, and the center-left became more free market. Both united around a deregulatory consensus with the left specializing in cultural deregulation and the right in economic deregulation. You know, so you could say that by the time you get to the Clinton administration, and I would call it Clintonism, you get cultural deregulation, they specialize in cultural deregulation, but basically acquiesce to economic deregulation. And by the time you get to the Republican Party, certainly by the time you get to the Romney campaign in 2012, but probably before, 9/11 masked a lot of trends in our political culture, I think, for most of the Bush administration. Basically, you get Republican Party specializing in economic deregulation, but acquiescing to progressive cultural deregulation. So that's how I sort of see the last generation of our political culture. And so both parties, mostly, they kind of fused together into the establishment. And it's more evident in European context where somebody like Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron are patrons of a kind of moderate, you know, right-sizing of the economy to make it more competitive in the global system, and at the same time further cultural progressivism in their own societies. Now, neoliberalism is the term that captures, I think, this convergence. It was already assuming a dominant role when George H.W. Bush addressed the United Nations in 1990 after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And in that speech, he praised the future, which was going to be characterized by open borders, open trade, and open minds. You know, speechwriters, they know what words, if you will, resonate. And clearly Bush's speechwriters felt that the open motif would resonate as, you know, a warm, good word. And this consensus, neoliberal consensus, solidified as administrations, both left and right, exported the so-called Washington consensus of free markets, along with open society norms of liberal democratic governance. Now, George W. Bush and Barack Obama were in that sense united. Like almost every public figure of the first 2 decades of the 21st century, they rang the changes on openness. In his second inaugural address, Bush promised to bring freedom to the entire world. In his last State of the Union address, Barack Obama used the buzzwords that by then were common among management consultants. He promised to put his shoulder to change and to support the spirit of innovation. And in one particularly telling and implausible but telling claim, he said, "The world respects us for our diversity and our openness." I want to, at this point, to pause, just to sort of take the measure of this. Harvard and similar institutions have so thoroughly indoctrinated you into the post-war consensus that it is almost impossible to gain any critical leverage on it. Change, diversity, innovation, creativity, breaking down boundaries, opening up new possibilities. What could possibly be harmful about these notions? So I think we're so thoroughly indoctrinated into this consensus, it's almost impossible for us to see these as anything other than positive terms. But I think if we step back, think about it, cheerleading for the creative class and for innovators is naive. And the moral and even metaphysical prestige of diversity is nonsensical. These evocations of open-ended and fluid existence run counter to the human desire for permanence. After all, death is the greatest innovation that awaits each of us. It is the moment in which we will be diversified into our original inorganic elements. Now, to be human is to seek shelter from death's onslaught. This is a spiritual enterprise and not just a physical one. When Homer sang of the warriors on the plains of Troy, he was sheltering their memories, protecting their deeds from the dissolving power of time. Monuments, constitutions, and other acts of statesmanship alike seek to outfox and outrun mortality by sustaining traditions of civic life. To have a heritage anchors our fleeting lives in something greater, something that stretches back to a time before us and reaches forward into what is to come. It is the argument of my book that only the strong gods can shelter us. For only they promise transcendence. Only they speak the enchanting words that rouse our hearts. Abraham Lincoln called upon the strong gods. His famous speeches, quoted from Scripture, and evoke the sacred mission of America in many different poetic ways. Now, I would submit that people do not follow men because they are handsome or intelligent. They fall in behind those who strengthen them and make them somehow greater than the lowly worms we all know ourselves to be. To lead, therefore, is to provide shelter. The Song of Songs concludes with the pronouncement that love is strong as death. The strong gods evoke love and loyalty. Leaders are prophets and priests of the strong gods. And in that sense, they promise immortality. So this then, tonight, I would submit, is your dilemma, our dilemma. The post-war consensus drives out the strong gods, denying their existence. At Harvard, you were told that you should be leaders, and yet I would submit you cannot lead. Worse still, you were trained to take what people naturally fear, which is disillusion and death, and reformulate it as a promise of redemption. Multiculturalism, for example, encourages the disintegration and dissolution of what shelters those of us born in the West. And in so doing, it claims to deliver us the great blessings of an open, inclusive society. Libertarianism does the same, turning lead into gold with economic globalization. The market's invasion of every aspect of traditional life by a certain free market view is recast as a great triumph of non-coercive order that is created by individual choices. This was certainly, I think, Hayek's moral argument in favor of free markets, is that the more pervasive free markets, the more anti-totalitarian a society would be. Barack Obama was an Ivy Leaguer to his bones, and he naturally tried to work this magic. When he recast one of the most fundamental challenges that we face as a country, which is our potentially explosive pluralism, he recast it as a cherished achievement when he would repeat the mantra, diversity is our strength. No, so I would submit that you are so trained in disenchantment, or what I call a discourse of weakening, that reinforces this banishment of the strong gods. As I observed in the book, a rigorous scientism coexists quite easily with postmodern critique at Harvard. This is because sociobiology and the latest post-colonial studies are both anti-metaphysical. Both go down in critical analysis, down, showing that the truths of the human condition are somehow below. What really matters are the instincts of survival, selfish genes, lust for domination, will to power, or some other blind impulse. I think sort of Stephen Greenblatt's book, The Swerve, I think captures this quite nicely, this impulse to go down. So, for instance, Yale recently announced the termination of its survey class, Introduction to Western Art. That class had to go, not because it was too Western, too white, or too male, although those were the reasons that were given. No, that was not the real reason. The reason is this. The old course, like the old Western Civ classes, has as its object appreciation and even love. Love has a consecrating and limiting dynamic. It closes upon the object of love. An open and inclusive society, therefore, must drive out love. That seems to me to be that ultimately the open society has to be a loveless society. Let me put this more concretely so you see what I'm saying here. When you look upon Michelangelo's David, the statue in Florence, you must suppress the impulse to relish or appreciate. You must be taught in ways that diffuse the power of that work of art, its power over your soul. You must think about that statue as an expression of Florence's power, or see it as an emblem of white male aristocratic privilege, or write a term paper about the statue's role in Western art history as it secured the dominance of the white body over the black body. Whatever the approach, be it post-colonial, feminist, Marxist, or some other so-called critical method, the required pedagogy of our time teaches you to regard that magnificent sculpture as a tool or an instrument or a weapon, not as an object towards which you might fall in love and feel a sense of devotion towards. So I think that's why the course had to go. It was a course that enticed students to love, and that's contrary to the aim of the open society. Now, I have dwelt on postmodern tropes in art history in this little digression into Michelangelo's David, but I could just as well have focused on sociobiology or some other technocratic discourse. Aside from some exceptional professors, the going down analysis, I say going down to things that are below, is all that you are offered in higher education and now increasingly in secondary education in the United States. As a consequence, unless you are religious or come from some sort of marginal countercultural educational background, you are almost entirely ignorant of the discourses of strengthening, which is to say the languages of love. This means in turn that you can at best manage and administer, but you cannot lead. As St. Augustine observes, a mass becomes a people when they are united in shared loves. To lead requires articulating and nurturing shared loves. Now, strictly defined, sort of shifting now to where we are today, strictly defined, populism is the politics of a country in which the official leadership class has lost the trust of the general population. In these circumstances, unauthorized or uncouth leaders emerge, evoking, and they inevitably evoke, choruses of denunciation from the existing establishment. And it is obvious that we are living in such a time of populism. I mean, the evidence of the choruses of denunciation are plain to see. I mean, it probably would have difficulty wearing a red MAGA hat on the Harvard campus. The standard approach to populism blames the people. In 2012, Mitt Romney wrote off half the country as takers. Not to be outdone, 4 years later, Hillary Clinton derided them as deplorables. These are but instances of a widespread sentiment that reminds me of the comment of the General Secretary of the Communist Party during the worker uprising in East Germany in the early 1950s. The comment was to the effect that the people were at risk of losing the confidence of the government. Now, I take a different view than does the establishment. In my view, our society is being shipwrecked by its designated leadership class, of which you and I are a part. Imbued with end-of-history fantasies, we've midwifed a globalized economy in which we flourish while high school educated Americans flounder. Multiculturalism and the rhetoric of diversity forbid a common culture. And this too benefits the elite. For a common culture provides ordinary people with a basis around which to unite and hold the rich and powerful accountable. And the oppressively dominant open society consensus has sponsored the demolition of moral norms, abandoning whole swaths of the American population to their self-destructive vices. In a time of unprecedented drug overdose use, for example, our supposed leaders support the legalization of marijuana. And then when the male-female dance has been thrown into disarray, they celebrate drag queens and press for transgender rights. So I would say, travel to the decaying neighborhoods of Baltimore or the failing towns of West Virginia, and you can see our failures. Or go to the super-rich San Francisco and observe the feral youth sleeping on the sidewalks and people shooting up in the BART stations. For that matter, consider the vast number of police with body armor and automatic weapons, something that I never saw as a young man growing up in Baltimore, Maryland. By and large, the United States is populated by decent people who, while from diverse backgrounds, want to get along and work together to secure a future for their children. But we are cursed with a failed leadership class emerging from institutions like Harvard. In his 2016 campaign, Trump would say that our country is being run, as he would put it, by very stupid people. Now that stupidity is not technical, but it is metaphysical. Now I take heart in Trump's presidency. His campaign and his leading initiatives are not easily correlated with the open society themes of deregulation and freedom. True, Trump signed the tax bill that enacted many Reagan-era priorities, and establishment Republicans laud the administration for its relaxation of business regulation. But it is telling that while those initiatives, while opposed by Democrats, do not raise anyone's blood pressure. This is not surprising, for cutting taxes and deregulating run in the familiar grooves of the last generation's conception of politics as a pursuit of freedom, and where freedom is conceived of as openness and, term I use in the book, weakening. By contrast, the wall and Trump's immigration policies evoke intense anguish. The administration's immigration policies, unlike his tax policies, have been litigated and are subject to judicial restraint. Trump's aggressive stance toward China has fundamentally reoriented both parties. To a degree unimaginable only 3 years ago, there's a bipartisan anti-China consensus, which, given China's role in the global economy, is in truth an anti-globalization consensus. And this too evokes a great deal of anguish, whether it's from the Wall Street Journal editorial page or the New York Times editorial page. Finally, and I think this is hard to put one's finger on, but I think we all feel it, finally, the mere fact of Trump in the White House disrupts and threatens the status quo. And it was while watching the 2016 Republican National Convention that I first understood the significance of Trump. Ted Cruz ran in that 2016 primary in a way that he imagined would appeal to the fervent base of the Republican Party. What he imagined the Tea Party to be all about. And his convention speech was in that vein. It was Reaganism on steroids. He must have used the word freedom 100 times in that speech. By contrast, Trump's acceptance speech at the Republican convention did not use that word at all, as I recall. Instead, his speech emphasized themes of protection and reconsolidation, of which is epitomized by the slogan, "Make America Great Again." There's a slogan of reconsolidation. Now, a similar disruption I would submit is rocking the Democratic Party. What is the result, by the way? Does anybody have any, do we have any results from Iowa?
It's too early. Too early.
Too early? But we'll see as it goes on. A similar disruption is rocking the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders was recently challenged to proclaim his fealty to the transgender cause, the latest stage of the left's program of cultural deregulation. He obliged, but he immediately pivoted to his promise to provide universal health coverage and thus to meet the needs of all vulnerable people in America. So it's a kind of all vulnerable people message from Sanders. So there's a similar disruption. Just as the economic deregulatory part of the Republican consensus is being rocked by re-regulation, whether it's the Democratic Party is going to be rocked by a candidate that's not interested in cultural deregulation, but rather in economic reconsolidation. And I think it's an interesting. I think you don't have to have too much of a metaphysical imagination to see the commonality between these two candidates. Although vastly different in many respects, Trump and Sanders emphasize solidarity, or perhaps even more accurately, they emphasize protection. Their message is, I will protect you. They promise to shelter ordinary people, and they attack failing elites. Trump by ignoring and insulting them, and Sanders by deriding them as greedy. What they represent is by no means enough, I would submit, for the challenge that we face as a country, but it's a start. Our job, it seems to me, is to build on these new beginnings. We need to recognize that diversity is not our strength. Rather, solidarity is our strength. In this respect, Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign slogan was correct. The slogan was, stronger together. That's absolutely correct. Now, solidarity is an active loyalty that aspires to be faithful to shared loves. The strong gods generate these loves. They are strong because they have the power to demand sacrifice and to win loyalty. The strong gods conquer our self-interest. This conquest brings the reward of transcendence and offers presentiments of a triumph over death. For when we are liberated from enclosure within our private worlds, we enter into shared loves that will outlast us. There's a natural transcendence in unity towards a common civic end. If we are to lead, we must petition and serve the strong gods. We need to insist upon shared loves, to identify them, describe them, to embellish upon them, to encourage, and even to inflame them. In the symposium, Plato describes reason's ascent of the ladder of love. In the Republic, the allegory of the cave shows that critical reason, while essential for wise leadership, breaks the bonds of falsehood in order to free us to rise towards the illumination that comes from above. Critical reason frees us to rise. It does not take us down to what is below. The same lessons can be learned from the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament, where Lady Wisdom has all these warns of the men of the city that hanging out with these loose ladies is going to lead to their ruin, but she tries to reason with them, but it's unsuccessful, and so she regroups, and she lays out a great banquet, and she sends out her beautiful maidens, and the men of the city are romanced by the beauty of the maidens, and they come into the house of Lady Wisdom to be instructed by her. This is what I learned from St. Augustine, which is perverse and debasing loves can only be cured by purer and higher loves. So, in conclusion, I think that we have to recognize that all that we learn in places like Harvard must be subordinated to the strong gods, that our critical reason needs to be used to purify rather than to weaken love's demands. As I said on so many occasions, John recounted it in his introduction, only this kind of leadership will forestall the return of the dark gods that rise up from below. So I would submit that this is the challenge that all of us face going forward. How do we nurture and purify the loves that ennoble in order to forestall the return of the loves that debase? Thank you.